Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. We have been waiting for this day ever since we got the plethora of Apple announcements last week. The new iPads are also out and they're also getting reviews. Well, technically, everything will be out tomorrow, and today there's reviews for everything. However, I do not think that the A16 iPad or the M3 iPad Air need a lot of coverage. Otherwise, this video would be way too long. I haven't even seen that many A16 iPad reviews. I've only seen like a few M3 iPad Air reviews yesterday. So for all intents and purposes, it's a slightly better iPad Air than the M2 version. For other intents and purposes, you probably are better off getting a reused, refurbished, or heavily discounted like M2 MacBook Pro. And if you're just like gearing for something super high end, get the M4 version. For the A16 iPad, if you're really going on a budget with the iPad and you're not willing to go refurbished, discounted, and stuff like that, then that $350 iPad at 128 gigabytes of base storage, 6 gigs of RAM, A16 processor is a pretty decent deal. Jan joining, saying he is saying hi from Germany's nicest city, Hamburg. Yeah, maybe. We can have some agreements or disagreements. I definitely would say it's better than Berlin. So it's not like I'm defending my hometown here. I guess some points for Munich, but then some minus points for some obvious reasons there. But yeah, that's neither here nor there. We can get right into it. A small shout out for you guys to do the YouTube jazz, as we call it around here. I know it's not always easy to join because there is no like super concrete schedule and I don't stream for very long. It's usually 2 at max 3 hours. Most of the streams around 1.5 hours. So I appreciate each and every one of you who can join. And while you're joining, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. Like the video, share it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it, and comment. You guys see a lot of interacting with a lively live stream, lively live chat. You can also send a super chat or a super sticker as a sign of direct support right there in the live chat, or you can become a supporter over on Patreon or right here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica, Max, Maximus, and Steve, who are all MarkTech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube. Also, hi to Relay joining the chat. Thank you guys. You've been so more engaged. I know, obviously, we got new Macs, new iPads. So this is a somewhat rare occurrence in the year. I know this community is way more focused on like the performance products by Apple rather than the iPhone, which still is pretty funny the way it happened. It probably goes all the way back to like my in defense of the M2 iPad Pro video. And Rosa joining the chat. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, so keep this up and we'll get into it right away. We have a plethora of topics. So of course we do have the reviews covering everything from the M4 MacBook Air and the new Mac Studio. With the new Mac Studio, there's more data than usual because we are getting a new processor in town, the M3 Ultra. So it will be interesting. Here they're using the M4 Max on the MacBook Pro as a juxtaposition. However, there is obviously now also a Mac Studio with the M4 Max, which will be cheaper than a MacBook Pro for most people. So because most likely you already have a display, a monitor to connect it to. If you're buying something in that price range. But I'm just saying, this is a very interesting generation because not only did it take us a while to go from M2 Ultra to M3 Ultra, but M3 Ultra is now launching not just after the release of the M4 generation on the iMac, the Mac Mini, the MacBook, but also now even with an M4 chip on the Mac Studio itself, with the $2,000 Mac Studio featuring the M4 Max and the $4,000 Mac Studio featuring the M3 Ultra. So it's a more confounding getting more confusing choice. We've discussed it now time and time again on this channel, why it might be the case. Apple might have had a lot of M3 Max dies to utilize. Maybe the Ultra Fusion interconnect, which is still the same as they've used on the M1 Ultra and the M2 Ultra, would have ended up bottlenecking the M4 Max. Maybe they're preparing everything for a complete SOIC overturn on the M5 Ultra, so at that point it just didn't make sense to even build in an Ultra Fusion interconnect onto the M4 Max. Maybe they had production issues with the M3 Ultra and they actually planned launching it a lot earlier. So who knows? Just today, by the way, we got like the launch of the Ryzen 9900X 3D and the 9950X 3D, and those are consisting of two chiplets, two CPU chiplets, and one I/O die that are all interconnected. And one thing why, for example, these chips are launching way later than the 8-core 9800X 3D, while the chips we are getting today are 12 and 16 core processors, is because there's a lot of latency in inter-chiplet communication, and that latency, especially in tasks like gaming that really like low latency, really could end up hurting your performance. So AMD basically had to rewrite all the scheduling commands for Windows in a way. I believe they wrote like an entire like subprogram that basically hijacks Windows in that regard, and it basically prevents Windows from almost using the second CPU chiplet if you're gaming. So there's no latency penalty by having to go to that extra chiplet. Obviously, this is not a gaming device now, but if you're ever asking yourself why are sometimes like multi-die chips coming out later than single die configurations, even though technically it's just two of those combined, there is more software problems to solve. You can and should keep optimizing the hardware for the interconnect. So it's a very interesting era we are finding ourselves in. Also, those interconnects are not cheap, and now with NVIDIA's like huge AI boom, also not very readily available. Like, it will be interesting to see if Apple can get as much SOIC supply as they need to make like really big sales of M5 Ultra, if that is even their plan. Jan saying, yeah, next we're getting the M2 Extreme, right? We're getting the 4-die M2 Max combined chip, which had been rumored in the past, so who knows? Don't jinx it. We might still get it. I would like to start with basically some light consumption here. I just got in from work, just changed my shirt. So we will start actually with what I consider a pretty good review by Marques for the M4 MacBook Air. Not because it's like filled with super detailed benchmarks or battery life analysis or like screen uniformity tests or shit like that, which all has its value, but I do believe that for the regular consumer, the main points he's making, and he's making it in a more succinct, more short form way than he usually does, is actually a pretty good thing. So it's an 8-minute video. I think we can go through it in like 12 or 15 minutes at most. So without further ado, let's get started. By the way, guys, as always, let me know what the audio and video quality is working for you. That was pretty loud for me. Hopefully it wasn't quite as loud for you guys. If there are any streaming issues between me and Marques, if one is way louder than the other. So hopefully it all works out. Let's get started. No, not moving the sound. Let's get to the start.
All right, I think we can make this pretty short and sweet. The Mac team...
By the way, that looks blue to me. Like, I know, and by the way, I don't have the greatest color sight on earth. Far from it. I've seen people say, oh, it doesn't look very blue. It obviously isn't a very saturated blue, but the implication that it's not like blue is a little bit weird to me. It's a very clear light blue.
Is on one. See, the M4 Mac Mini refresh was already one of the best tech deals of all of 2024.
$600 for almost the same configuration as the MacBook Air. So you are getting on the Mac Mini 16 gigs of RAM, 256 gigabytes of storage, and an M4 chip. That M4 chip on the Mac Studio, though, even in its base configuration, is fully enabled. It's not binned. It's 10 CPU cores, 4P, 6E cores, and it's 10 GPU cores. While on the MacBook Air, if you're going for the absolute base configuration, you are paying $1,000 for 16 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, and an M4 chip that has 10 CPU cores, but only 8 GPU cores. So, however, once you upgrade to the 512 gigabyte model, you get the faster dual port charger included. You, of course, get the extra storage, and you get the fully enabled M4 chip. And I don't recommend getting any of those devices with less than 512 gigabytes. With the Mac Mini, yes, because it's a desktop device, you might constantly keep it connected to like external storage, but even then I still think for like RAM swap and stuff like that, an internal storage of 512 would probably be good. But I also don't recommend getting those devices with like I think 1 terabyte can be okay for the MacBook Air if you really know you can fill it up. But usually, if you're interested in those kinds of configurations, I do recommend looking more at the M4 or even the M4 Pro MacBook Pro.
Computer, great price.
Jan, you're saying you're loving your M4 Mac Mini. Well, what's your config, man? What did you get?
So now here comes this new M4 MacBook Air. It's the most capable, powerful version yet, obviously, thanks to the new chip. The starting memory is 16 gigs. It gets a sneaky, slightly larger.
Which should also be included, by the way. There are plenty of M2 and M3 MacBook Airs out there. Now it's 700 USD, 800 USD, maybe 850 USD with 16 gigabytes. So because Apple updated the M4 MacBook Pro last November to start at 16 gigabytes of RAM, they simultaneously gave both the M2 and the M3 MacBook Air 16 gigabyte base configurations at that point, $999 and $1099. So these models are also heavily price reduced now versus the M4 MacBook Air. And if you are willing to go for an 8 gigabyte older gen, Marquez later calls out like a $700 config. I don't think 8 gigabytes should be $700 when you get $1,000 device with a newer chip, newer camera, and of course 16 gigabytes at $1,000. I just don't think that makes sense. You should 8 gig MacBook Airs. Probably look at them at like in the $600 price zone, like maybe $650 is roughly the max that I would look at. Like maybe 8 gigs plus 512 gigs could make sense at $700, but it's still not the greatest deal. Jan got the standard config, so I assume you mean the lowest one, right? Because I'm not asking like necessarily, you cannot upgrade the processor anyway, and 16 gigs of RAM should be plenty if all you're doing is editing photos. But like, I think 512 is one of the configs, isn't it? Like right on the website, you don't necessarily have to go into the separate configurator. Apple just does that for like logistics reasons, I guess.
Your battery, some Thunderbolt improvements, a new webcam, a new color, and the price goes down. It's kind of funny looking back a bit at the arc of reviewing MacBook Airs over the years. Like at first it was this spectacle of engineering, but also kind of impractical and missing a few ports.
Yeah, I assume, by the way, that this is kind of what Apple hopes to get with the iPhone 17 Air, that keeping it thin, especially if down the road they expect technology like silicon carbide batteries to get a lot cheaper. Maybe they'll believe that like they can use pretty small sensors, but just make them way more HDR capable, use way more image compute and stuff like that. And I think at some point they might hope to create an iPhone Air that is as distinct and as popular as the MacBook Air, right? Because believe it or not, the market for $700 smartphones, which Apple kind of moved out of in a lot of ways. I mean, the base iPhone 16 is $800. If Apple ever wants to get back to that market, the iPhone 16 with 16e with 256 gigabytes is not the way to do that. It would be like an iPhone Air at 6.3 inches at that point, at $700, and then an iPhone Air at 6.6 or 6.7 inches for $800, and then the Pros at that point might start as high as $1,100 or even $1,200 for a similar sized model. And I mean, that might sound a little funny. Oh, the iPhone Air one iPhone gets cheaper and the other more expensive. But think about it. The 13-inch MacBook Air starts at $1,000. The 14-inch MacBook Pro starts at $1,600, right? And that's with more storage, sure, but that's 1/3 then price difference, right? So it's $1,200 configuration versus the $1,600 configuration. That's a big price difference. Why not do the same on the iPhone at that point? Especially on the iPhone, where profit margins, especially on the Pro models, are super huge, and people are probably not gonna like nickel and dime themselves to say, oh, I used to buy like $1,000 iPhone Pro, but now it's 1,200. You know what? I'm actually gonna downgrade to an Air. Most people will just get the Pro and maybe stick with it for a year longer. So yeah, that's just my speculation based on the history of the MacBook Air. For now, I think that an iPhone Air is pretty pointless, and I think it's way too compromised if it's gonna get rid of features like stereo speakers and potentially stuff like MagSafe. But down the road, Apple can also keep improving that iPhone Air. They can make it slightly thicker, especially if the Pro models simultaneously keep getting thicker, which is also what happened with the Mac, right? Then the Air can be a little thicker again.
It went from that to being, a bit of an outdated design, but improving a lot. Then turned into basically the easiest to recommend laptop in the world at $999. But then with Apple Silicon updates and higher base storage, the price did go up with the M2.
Actually, we did not get higher base storage for years and years. Like after 128, we jumped to 256 actually relatively quickly. But then we just stayed there. Apple Silicon did not change the storage game. We got the price increase on the M2 MacBook Air primarily because of the redesign.
Generation by $200, so it was $1199, and I feel like everyone just kind of went, all right, it's still fine. Yeah, still a good laptop for that price. But now it's 2025 and it's got the M4 chip and the price has dropped back down.
This is also very interesting, and I keep bringing that up in all my last few videos, because amidst all the new tariffs, to launch a MacBook Air not only at the same price, because I assume if Apple increases pricing, they will just do it uniformly across all products, right? But they might give slightly different percentage increases based on each device. But to launch a product before tariffs at a lower price point, giving yourself less wiggle room for the future, because now all of these reviews are basically praising this Mac specifically at the $1,000, or the way I do it at $1,200. But now I just wonder how Apple will treat that if actually like the 20% tariffs on China are seemingly here to stay. Trump just announced new aluminum and steel tariffs on Canada, and I believe on Mexico too, though. The metal stuff is more Canada related. So that just makes the entire world market for like even crucial things like the aluminum supply here more expensive in general. Not to say that the supply of aluminum and steel from Canada to America impacts the price of the Chinese-made MacBook Air, but it's a global market. Something that impacts the aluminum and steel supply for the car market will down the road also impact other aluminum and steel prices.
To $999 for the base machine again. And that is sick. Now, almost nothing else has physically changed with this laptop. Still the same keyboard. There's no speaker grills. There's still MagSafe charging, 2 USB Type-C ports, the headphone jack, the notch at the top of the 60 Hz LCD, the thin and light aluminum build. This is very much still the MacBook Air.
And it still has like distinct disadvantages versus the MacBook Pro. Its speaker system is worse. Its bezels are thicker, right? So while yes, it might, and of course the 60 hertz, 500 nit screen actually slightly lower pixel density too, which is interesting because that's not a distinction Apple makes that often. I believe it is, guys. Am I wrong? Like the pixel density on the MacBook Air is lower, isn't it? So I believe MacBook Air. Oh, Jesus Christ, tech specs. So it's a 13-inch display. Blah blah blah. 224 ppi, while I believe the MacBook Pro is around 254, if I'm not mistaken. Guys, we have more people watching than likes. Please consider leaving a like. It helps us attract more people to watch. It helps us grow the community. All support is very, very much appreciated. So the tech specs, I hate that it takes like some scrolling to bring up the tech specs. With 254, yeah, got that exactly right. That's nice. So my brain still works.
If you want to get sweaty about it.
Of course, also the M4 MacBook Pro, one thing we didn't get on the M4 MacBook Air that we kind of expected because it was new to the M4 MacBook Pro and it was kind of specifically covered as part of like the M4 chip, and that was an extra Thunderbolt port. So the expansion of I/O is happening on the MacBook Air in the sense that it now supports multiple monitor output even when your display lid is open, but it does not get an extra Thunderbolt 4 port. And then, of course, if you're moving up to the M4 Pro and M4 Max MacBook Pros, now you're also getting things like Thunderbolt 5, which are, of course, like leagues ahead, but probably overkill for the vast majority of consumers.
As Dave 2D would say, I noticed the mute button icon is
that
different,
one is also a
and
change
the webcam
happening
is
on
now
like the
a
new
12
Magic
megapixel center stage
keyboards.
webcam, which can follow you around the frame if you leave it on, but I actually do turn it off every time.
Also, the camera seems to be just like definitively better quality too. So it's not just about the same quality for like a 1080p cutout and then a big amount of like empty space around you because it's ultra wide. It is both ultra wide, but also on the small area where you see your face, it is higher detail and better in low light.
And also, I noticed on Apple's website, the battery capacity went up slightly from 50.
Yeah, that was actually interesting in his initial coverage because this was a spec point that I barely saw and cared about. I mean, it's 1 watt hour increase, 1.2. Yeah, but I guess there's more battery here.
2.6 watt hours to 53.8 watt hours this generation. So that's about 2% more capacity. I'm paying attention, okay? It's a real life spot the differences challenge. But really the main way, obviously, you'll know if it's the new laptop generation or not is this. Did you notice it's a new color? Barely. It's called sky blue this time.
Here it looks
if
blue.
I could rename it, I'd rename it barely blue, considering when it's up against white backgrounds, okay, it looks a little bit blue.
But I have to say, though, unlike something like Starlight, which to me is neither golden enough nor silver enough to be a distinct color, I really don't like it that much, though I have known now a few people who actually love it. It doesn't have the appeal to me that something like rose gold used to have. But for a MacBook Air, like this playful blue touch, yes, it might be a tad too subtle, but I prefer it more subtle than super in your face. Like, you still want to be able to, like, even if you take it with you to school and maybe it's a little bit less serious there, what if down the road you want to take it to university and then to a business meeting, right? Or you sell it to somebody who might want to use it that way. A slightly more serious color variant might help with the resale value. I'm not against playful colors. For example, on iPads, I'm all for it. But I am okay with this barely sky blue.
But when it's up against actually blue things, It literally looks silver again. It's like the LaCroix of MacBook
Yeah, and you're having an
paint colors.
M2
It's like
iPad Air
someone
that's
whispered the word blue in the paint shop just before placing each
pink,
one in its
I
box and
guess,
shipping it
would
away.
be the English
But yeah,
word.
now if you see this pale
Or
blue color
purple?
on a MacBook Air,
In this
know it's
case,
the new one.
because
This
English
replaces
uses
space
like
gray. But also,
sometimes
speaking
weird
of
words in the
boxes,
way it's translated
this is
from
the
German.
box that my MacBook Air came in from Apple, the review unit. And I don't know if you notice on the corner there, it appears someone has bled onto the box of this computer. I don't really know how that happens. I pulled it out of the cardboard shipping box, and it just looked like
So
this.
it's not
Really
something
weird.
that happened
Never seen
in
that
like
before.
transit.
I really hope whoever packaged
It's
this
something that
computer
happened in
is
like
okay.
China.
Anyway, the main reason this laptop is such a big deal is the chip. Right?
Purple,
This M4
okay.
chip. It's really good. We already learned this from the M4 iPad Pro.
Apple's purples on like their iPads and I believe the iMac had like a purple version. It's way better than like that one-time dark purple thing they pulled off with the iPhone 14 Pro. That one was abysmal.
9 months ago, and then again with the M4 Mac Mini 4 months ago. This chip in a laptop will be passively cooled, so no fans in the air, unlike the Mac Mini. So yeah, sustained performance ceiling is going to be a bit lower. But for the quick, bursty stuff like normal computer activities, yeah, it's amazing, as expected. And then the specific benefit, in case you forgot, of the M4 over previous generations of Apple Silicon is going to be more AI-specific horsepower. So a more powerful 16-core neural engine. Some of that manifests itself in useless.
I'm just reading some news on Twitter, by the way, that says Samsung begins mass production of their 4th gen 4 nanometer process. Jesus Christ, just let it die, Samsung, or at least give it to like the Nintendo Switch 2. One thing that I'm really afraid of is that the Switch actually ends up with an 8/7 nanometer Samsung chip, which is more like a TSMC 10 nanometer, which was a very short-lived note. That would be really, really bad.
Stuff like image playground, rendering image.
It's not useless. It depends on what you do. It knows your faces, like the people in your photo library. Once the indexing is all done, it's very fun. I've sent it to like my nieces and nephew. I've sent it to a few friends who have like kids. I don't have kids. Their kids loved it. And yes, I know I can feed that stuff to ChatGPT and stuff like that. But I can run this on device. There's no limitation on how often I can run this. There's no risk of any of the data being used for anything nefarious. And it's just fast and playful. But Genmoji is better than Image Playground. Image Playground is useless as anything beyond the gimmick. I'll absolutely give you that. But Genmoji is legit to me like an extra feature in my keyboard now.
Images locally faster than ever before. Cool. But also some of that is potentially useful stuff, like the background cutouts being quicker and more accurate, or the single-click photo enhancer in Pixelmator Pro being much faster. Reviewing MacBook.
That's also very important. Like a lot of people like to complain about the focus of AI, but AI is not just Apple Intelligence. It's not just running an offline version of DeepSeek like model or something like that. It's also a lot of features that nowadays are included in stuff like Pixelmator and Photoshop and even Adobe Premiere. And while yes, some of those features might be better off running from the cloud than on your device, if you can run them on your device without completely killing your battery and while still fitting in whatever RAM capacity you have, you might have a winner on your hand.
MacBook Airs is so funny though, because we do this every time. This is the baseline. This is the cheapest entry-level way to get a Mac laptop for people who don't care about pro-level tasks. They're just going to check their email. And
this is also why I think this is a good review. I think that if this was exactly the same price, I think I would be asking certain things like, why is the display not at least 100 nits brighter, right? Why is it exactly the same panel? We know you have panels that go to 600 nits that are still 60 hertz and stuff like that. Why is there not a third USB-C port? You clearly can do it, that we've seen from the M4 MacBook Pro. But given that it's actually cheaper in this complicated economy that we are now in, thanks to One Orange, that to me actually just that just lets me be grateful. And yes, we can argue, should the $1,000 have maybe 512 gigs of storage, or maybe even something fun like 384? Yes, 256 is definitely not much, but don't forget your 512 gigabyte version is also cheaper than it was before. So if it ever seemed acceptable to you to have a 13 or even $1,400 MacBook Air with 512 gigabytes, well, now it's $1,200.
Web browse and maybe edit a photo once in a while. Basic stuff. MacBook Air, classic. But because Apple Silicon has gotten so good, we end up able to do things that are way beyond that. This machine is capable of things that required a Pro chip like a couple of years ago. That's not an exaggeration. So when I tell you I could load up a bunch of 4K and 8K,
it's way faster than an M1 Pro in many ways. And architecturally, there's just a few things that you don't want to do with no Intel chip for that matter, but not even a first, or to a lesser degree, even a second generation Apple Silicon chip, like 3D rendering and stuff like that.
footage into a Final Cut Pro timeline, and it would scrub through the timeline with almost no hesitation at quarter res playback resolution, and then it could export the project just a few beats slower than a Mac Mini. That literally doesn't matter to 99% of MacBook Air.
And that difference might actually be down to the binned M4, right? If you're using the base configuration here, that might not even be a difference in like active versus passive cooling.
Buyers. But the chip is so powerful, it's capable of it, so it's just good to know that you could. Most Airs will never have 3D modeling applications or Logic Pro or ever be churning through the Adobe suite or playing AAA games, but instead they'll be doing video calls and having 20 Safari tabs open or flipping through a bunch of productivity apps. But it is
those 20 Safari tabs is also partially why I recommend getting the higher storage configuration, because yes, I say it time and time again, more storage does not equal more RAM. Even on macOS, but what it does, it definitely gives your RAM a little bit more room to breathe. Yes, with 16 gigabyte, you should still be fine. With 24, you probably are not doing swap on the MacBook Air at all. But still, you probably, like, once you're getting to 24 gigs of RAM, you're probably better off looking at an M4 or even like maybe like a cheaper M3 Pro MacBook Pro.
That this computer can stretch and handle all of that, should you choose to throw that at it. That is the modern MacBook Air. There's even allegedly a customer that was frustrated with the last generation of Air because it couldn't connect two different 6K displays at the same time and use them with the lid open. And so now this one can. So, okay, great.
That being said, it wasn't just a complaint about connecting two 6K displays. Unless you're working with like some workarounds with like extra USB-C hubs, and then it could create extra latency and stuff like that, you were also not getting even like two 1440p monitors. That's just not something the display controllers were built for back in the day. Of course, you had plenty of bandwidth. You still had like full Thunderbolt speeds on those ports. But just the chip couldn't use that bandwidth for so much display output. And that's primarily to blame on the fact that the base M series chip has always been kind of like an AX chip. Right, I mean, even going back to something like the first gen, like Apple Silicon developer kits, right, was like a Mac Mini with an A12Z chip, or I think it was an A12Z chip, right? And that's basically what the base M series chips became down the road. And now Apple is step by step optimizing them for more and more workflows that are a little bit more Mac specific. I still don't think that anybody's outputting an iPad to two screens.
This laptop is still a great machine and a great deal. Here's my only complaint potentially with this laptop.
And I would agree if this machine didn't get cheaper. But yeah, I do agree.
I would like a better display.
Sure.
Now, I know that I'm coming from a MacBook Pro and I'm very used to these really good displays, and it seems like Apple is, as they usually do, reserving certain things for the pros. So the mini LED, the ProRes high refresh rate, even the nanotexture coating on the display, all of that stuff is reserved for the MacBook Pro. But all that is stuff that I would like to see in a MacBook Air. And I think it can handle it. I think it's got plenty of battery. It could go brighter. It could look even better. So I want a better screen on the Mac.
Nano texture, like I don't think the logistics probably work out too much for the MacBook Air here. I'm not sure. I mean, it sells a lot, but like I think basically everyone who would want a nano texture display would want it on a more powerful machine. And in that regard, the M4 MacBook Pro actually has the advantage that it shares its hardware baseline with the M4 Pro and M4 Max MacBook Pros. But like, yeah, a 600 nit screen and at 120 hertz, so that would give it roughly the display capabilities of the 2018 iPad Pro. I think should be absolutely okay. But I do believe it's only going to happen once we get like extreme display levels on the pros. And by that, I mean stuff like tandem OLED screens. And who knows, by that point, Apple might, instead of preferring to give promotion to the cheaper MacBook, they might prefer to give it OLED, but then give it 60 hertz OLED just because.
MacBook Air, me personally, as an option. But I know that most people won't even notice and will be totally fine with this.
True.
But here's a more important question that I ask basically every year with this MacBook Pro, because we always talk about this base price.
Okay,
can you
MacBook Air, he misspoke.
actually order the base price spec and still be fine? And this year, again, I feel like for most people, the answer actually is yes. Because this time, that's...
Jan, you would like an iPhone with nano texture. It's probably better for Apple to introduce like something that is going to be standard across all iPhone models, similar to what the Galaxy S24 and S25 Ultra have, which isn't quite nano texture level, not even close, but it also creates way less color degradation for like your image. So probably that is going to be better. It was rumored for like the 16 Pro generation. So let's hope that it just was delayed to the 17 Pro generation. We might get it this year.
16 gigs of unified memory, and then it's 256 gigs of base storage. So the storage and memory upgrades are always borderline robbery. That's not a shocker. Like, I do like that you can get a much faster charger for $20 if you...
Yeah, but this is also like get 512 gigabytes. It helps with some RAM tasks. Again, you get that faster charger, and you get the fully unbinned M4.
Don't already have one. But yeah, doubling up to 16 gigs base for $999 is huge, since these computers can go into swap memory so quickly. Shout out to the single best feature of Apple Intelligence, which has been improving the amount of RAM in every Apple device. If you are in the market for a base machine though, I think if you don't plan on ever doing super high-end tasks, you can still consider the last gen. This is going to sound familiar, but the last gen is also a really good deal. It has half that memory, 8 gig.
Not necessarily. That's very important. I'm also not. I haven't seen that many like M2 and M2, yes, but like I've seen not so many M3 MacBook Airs left with 8 gigabytes. I think maybe big companies have found a way to get rid of them. Maybe they sold them off to businesses or found some internal use for them. But the things I see selling out right now and stuff like Amazon, like they are 16 gigabyte configurations.
But it's $799 at Best
So
Buy.
this is not something I recommend because like even just looking at Apple's usual pricing ladder, right? You would be paying $200 more traditionally to get this with 16 gigabytes. But now you're one generation of processor behind. So in this case, this configuration could be worth it at $700 at best. And at $650, it starts to look actually pretty cool. But if you're looking at an M3 MacBook Air at $800, look at it with 16 gigabytes of memory. Otherwise, it does not make sense to not get the M4 MacBook Air.
Buy right now. So that's a really good deal. Obviously, if you have an older MacBook, if you have an Intel MacBook, this is the type of stuff you're going to be looking at. Otherwise, then yeah, pretty easy to recommend.
Yeah,
the base.
And this is also why I don't see the reason to get into any deep analysis. We already know the M4 MacBook Pro. I know some people will talk a lot about thermals and maybe that it like hits like certain heat levels earlier and maybe it doesn't give you like 10-15% of the possible performance in terms of sustained power. Honestly, at the $600 entry price difference and the $400 price difference for the same storage, RAM, and bin configuration, I do not think that those things matter. And yeah, for all intents and purposes, if you know you want those extra things, that mini LED screen, that higher sustained performance, the extra USB-C port, the better speakers, the even better battery life, you know to look at the MacBook Pro, right? Like a lot of people will like focus on value, and they will ascribe like certain value to like certain specs, but at some point the budget for some people just ends, right? An $8,000 Mac Studio could be the best value Apple offers per storage, per RAM, per performance, but it wouldn't matter to 98% of their customers, because most people don't want first a desktop Mac, so that's already a little bit of a turnoff. But then the other point would be they don't want an $8,000 device. Like for most people, 4,000 is a big stretch. Like my Mac is like around $3,500 with some student discounts, $3,200. I'm definitely keeping it for years and years, not because I feel like I need to make my money's worth from it, but just because it's legit that good. And for personal economic reasons, for ecological reasons, I just don't see a reason to upgrade at this point. Even like betterments, like the 1000 nits brightness on the newer MacBook Pros, it's something I can get with better displays. Sure, I don't get the quantum dot, like more responsive screen. Sure, I don't get the same efficiency, but like for everyday performance, M1 is still plenty for most people. So don't get yourself like duped into either getting something too high end right now because, oh, I need everything I can get. I think MacBook Air 16 gigs, 512 gigs is perfect for most people. And if you're really willing to if you're looking to save money, depending on your use case, the M4 Mac Mini is great value by itself, even before any big discounts. And then discounted versions, but then just keep in mind that in that case, between 8 and 16 gigabytes of RAM, it actually does make sense to pay a little bit more money, because you will feel that difference. Even as a base user, maybe not all the time, probably definitely not all the time, but still, if you can get it the same config between M2 and M3 and 8 or 16 gigabytes, and you can get it the 16 one for $70 or $80 more, that I think is a worthwhile upgrade.
Baseline.
So thank you, Marquez. I actually think this was a really good video. I think this video went into a lot of like very common sense, like mass market truths about the things you kind of want and are better. And I think he actually rightfully contextualized like his demands or his wishes, like that for a better screen, for example, which I have also pointed out, like amidst the price reduction, I don't think those are actual issues. I think those are kind of wants and things to hopefully expect with next generations. One thing I really hope is that M5 really brings up base storage, and this time I'm not really even talking about value for the regular consumer, because I do think that at $1,200 it is the 512 gig is already good. But the reason why I hope it happens is because I don't want the people buying the base model to be basically permanently left out of stuff like higher end AAA gaming and potentially 3D artwork and stuff like that. Not to say that everyone wants to game, or certainly not that everyone wants to do 3D art, but it's an opportunity down the road. And 256 gig can legit be prohibitively little storage in that regard, while 512 gigabytes is actually surprisingly a high amount, because obviously some of your storage gets taken up by your operating system. You'll probably always have some data, like some mail and a few office documents stored, right? So if that's like 80 gigabytes of your 250 gigabytes, that leaves you with like 150, right? I know it's technically 170, but there's also like some disk fragmentation stuff that takes up storage. If you like assume the same 100 gigabytes taken away from your 512, that's now 400 gigabytes left, actually more than that. So at that point, you're not getting 2 times more storage, you're getting 2.5 times more real world storage. And on the 1 terabyte model, you're not even getting like 4 times the storage. At that point, you're getting like 6 times the storage, right? So that's a little bit of a rant that I have where people sometimes underestimate just how storage scales. And when people say, "Oh, 1 terabyte isn't even that much," I'm like, for most people it definitely is. So whenever I see people saying like, "Oh, 1 terabyte should be the minimum," I'm like, that would be wasteful too. I would rather have a $100 lower base price than start the MacBook Air with 1 terabyte, for example. But hopefully it will start with 512 relatively soon. So that's it for the MacBook Air. Thank you again, Marques, for a nice summary and review. Let's look into Dave 2D's video on the new Mac Studio, specifically focused on the M3 Ultra version and with its insane max 512 gigabytes of RAM configuration. It's important, this video is not designed to go into like every performance detail of the M3 Ultra. Down the road, we might look into something like a Geekervan review of it if it happens. We'll also look into a little bit more benchmarks today that are happening on sites like Ars Technica, but this is not the video. It would, given that we have already spent 45 minutes talking about the MacBook Air, we also have some other stuff like a potential redesign of iOS 19 to cover. We will not spend too much time. But also a little bit of criticism before we start to Dave 2D. Marques just showed us a really nicely paced, well done video for the MacBook Air. Not too many gimmicks. There was no, like, it's not like he spent his time like wasting your time or anything like that. And it was 8 minutes long for a relatively small year-to-year upgrade. The M3 Ultra is not as insignificant of an upgrade as the M4 MacBook Air. It warrants far, far deeper discussion. Like, I know Dave 2D likes to keep it short, but there is a difference, in my opinion, between keeping it short and making it way, way too short. So, yeah, this is where, like, correct pacing, and believe me, I suck at it. That's why I'm a live streamer, so I don't have to pace myself. But like 6 minutes for a new Mac Studio with the entire nuance of like, oh, some of them are M4 Max, some of them are M3 Ultra. I don't really like that.
So last week, the new M3 Ultra-equipped Mac Studio showed up here, and this thing is juiced. 32-core CPU, 80-core GPU, and for the first time
so
ever,
that's the max configuration. 32 cores. Here are 24 performance cores, 8 E-cores, 80-core GPU. Obviously, that's self-explanatory. It has 800 gigabits per second of bandwidth, so it still uses like basically 1000-bit bus because it combines two 512-bit bus M3 Max chips, but it uses slower memory modules. Like, these modules max out at 6400 megatransfers per second, while the one on the M4 Max go all the way up to 8533.
500.
You said cool video title. Is that because of German? Oh, exclamation point. True, I didn't notice that. That's probably some bug in the YouTube app, right?
112 gigs of RAM. It's crazy fast RAM as well. Now, a few years ago, when I got the first Mac Studio in with the M1 Ultra, that product was already overkill for my workflow. I was shooting off of like Blackmagic 6K cameras. Since then, I now have a more technically demanding workflow. I now shoot off 4 4K cameras that are shooting simultaneously. I'm editing live with an Elgato Stream Deck, and
it would be very important to know which like codec you're using, right? In that regard.
Pump all of it into a Mac Studio. But
like, I believe if you're handling 4K ProRes files, M2 Ultra should still be fine for that. So it's probably not. It's probably like some Sony stuff.
this product here does that workflow better. Obviously, it's the new one, bigger numbers. But
okay, so Cinebench
doesn't improve.
Sorry. So this is the M2 Ultra, 50% improvement in multi-core performance over the M2 Ultra. Adobe Premiere render being barely faster. yeah, the base M4, of course, here. Yeah, also, like, look at here the M1 Ultra. Like, sure, it's still faster than the base M4, but we have come a really, really long way. And yeah, M4 Max, of course, being faster than M1 or M2 Ultra. Some nice scaling here to roughly the same 50%. Actually, like with M4 Max outperforming the M2 Ultra, that basically should also tell you what I've been telling you for the last couple of videos, which is most people buying the new Mac Studio should probably consider the M4 Max. I've even outlined you should probably get the fully unbinned version with a little bit more storage and stuff like that, because it and RAM too, because it will help you have a really high-end premium experience without having to go with like all the way to a MacBook Pro. Plus, it still gives you like a great 128 gigabyte max RAM configuration, which, yes, it's not 256 or 512, but it's still going to be plenty for the vast majority of people. Only if you know you can like utilize those higher RAM counts or the extra GPU cores or anything like that, should you upgrade to the M3 Ultra. But at that point, you probably don't need me to tell you that.
Improve my workflow in any significant manner, at least not for the kind of footage that I would throw at it. Even with gaming, like titles run faster on this device because the M3
That's
Ultra
Valheim, right?
is a very powerful GPU. But let's be real here, no one's buying.
Or it's at Baldur's Gate, okay. Let me briefly turn off subtitles here. I don't think we need subtitles here in general. So GFX Bench, again, GFX Bench is an old, outdated test, but like, I would argue the M4 Max here is not looking really good in general. You get like a little bit over 20% more performance over the M2 Ultra, which roughly makes sense. Like, I mean, we can calculate it here, like 375 divided by 221. That's a 70% increase over the M4 Max. So that's actually pretty decent scaling, I would say. It would be roughly then 100% faster if this was just an M4 Ultra. And yeah, over an M1 Ultra, that's of course a pretty outdated tech at this point. It also didn't do the best job necessarily at scaling. But obviously you see like Baldur's Gate here, you get like 25% more performance over the M4 Max. So you definitely don't get the same scaling across the board. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, this is an Apple Silicon native title. But it's not the greatest optimized one. This is an x86 title running through Rosetta. It shouldn't probably be hitting CPU bottlenecks given how fast M3 is. Definitely how fast M4 is. But yeah, with M4 Max at 93, that's versus 133. I mean, that's roughly 50% more, a little bit less. 133 divided by 93. Yeah, it's 43% more. So, yeah, take that as you want. Definitely don't buy the M3 Ultra for gaming. If you are even planning to do any gaming on this device, you're probably better off. And, like, granted, if you plan on doing any gaming here and you need it for all your LLM work, though with the money you're spending there, you probably are better off getting a console on the side or building yourself a PC tower. But if you really want to use it for gaming, it can work. However, if gaming is your priority as much as it can be if you're buying a Mac, in terms of value, the M4 Max is just far, far better value.
Buying a machine with half a terabyte of RAM to play games. So what can this super machine do? Apple's marketing says that the M3 Ultra does significantly better at 3D rendering and compiling code compared to the previous generation, and it does have improvements for my testing. Maybe not as
M1 Ultra, M2 Ultra. What's interesting here is you get a significant uplift between M1 Ultra and M2 Ultra. This is less of an architectural improvement in the actual GPU cores and more that M2 Ultra was built to scale better than M1 Ultra. So this is almost like the difference between not hardware RT and hardware RT, but it's actually just the difference of 35% more raw performance and better scaling. M3 Ultra now more than doubles the performance of M2 Ultra because it brings hardware accelerated ray tracing. Now, it should be noted that, of course, DM4 Max offers you a second generation hardware accelerated ray tracing architecture, right? So, yes, it comes with a little bit of a raw performance bump, but also a little bit of specifically a ray tracing bump. However, and this is specifically to what we are looking at right now, you won't necessarily see that as much in Blender. After Apple went to like the Blender group and basically helped them optimize it for metal and stuff like that, we haven't seen many drastic changes in Blender when it comes to being like super optimized for macOS. Yes, of course, the RTX 5090 looms large here, almost 15,000 points, roughly doubling the performance of the M3 Ultra here. This, of course, being a $2,000 card, while this is a $4,000 Mac Studio. Granted, if you're building yourself a PC with the RTX 5090, you're probably making it a $4,000 PC roughly, but now you're getting way better value. Now, this, I've seen some people say, oh, Ultra Fusion is limiting it, which my question is like, by the way, like I want to give a little bit of respect here for Ultra Fusion as it was built for the M1 Ultra, because we are still using the same 2.5 gigabits per second or gigabytes per second, not quite sure here, between the M1 Ultra Fusion, the M2 Ultra Fusion, and the M3 Ultra Fusion. So the fact that we're still getting all that performance scaling with like what? Over like almost 5 times, 4.5 times the performance of the M1 Ultra. That's honestly surprising. Now, I did bring up that maybe an M4 Ultra, which roughly, like with the usual scaling, like 4,000 to 7,200, right? That's like a 77% scaling. Here you would roughly end up with like 8,500 to close to 9,000 points, maybe. Wait, no. No, it would actually be close to 9,000, right? Maybe at that point it would hit like an Ultra Fusion bottleneck, or maybe it's hitting memory bottlenecks. But anybody who's saying that the entire idea of like Ultra Fusion was bad because the RTX 5090, a huge GPU that is by itself like only a GPU, right? It doesn't house any CPU cores and stuff like that. It uses GDDR7, which has over double the max bandwidth of this chip, right? That's not a bad result. And probably with proper optimization, it should be more like here. But optics for the RTX cards on Windows, or Linux too, I guess, in Blender is just too good. Like the way optics is built on top of CUDA, it's really, really good for ray tracing. Unfortunately, Apple does not get that advantage.
As big as Apple's claims are, but the standout feature to
So
me,
Xcode, now we are looking at CPU stuff. So this is versus the M2 Ultra. Nice reductions, a little bit less than a third. M1 Ultra here. So nice generational scaling, no like big bottleneck to see. MacBook Pro. Okay, so this is just the MacBooks, and yeah, of course. Like, and by the way, one thing that you can see, these tasks do not endlessly scale with more CPU cores either, because like we have the difference here between like an M1 based Mac Mini with 8 CPU cores, that's 4 performance and 4 efficiency cores, versus now a 32 core M3 Ultra, right? And it's roughly 3 times faster. It should be noted though, whatever he's testing here, it's not an ideal task. Any task that runs like way below 5 minutes on an M1 is arguably too small to properly leverage cores and RAM amounts and bandwidth on those higher tasks. If maybe this was like a 20-minute or half an hour code compilation, yeah, because this is a seconds. It's not, it doesn't say minutes, right? This is just 3 minutes. This is a little bit of a too small task. It's one thing we always mentioned when we are talking about like Geekbench GPU tests, like where they usually don't like go far enough in leveraging like really large GPUs. This is now this for but for CPUs
is actually the 512 gigs of RAM. That allows users to run really large AI models locally, like the ability to do it on device without having to send stuff to the cloud. So for a lot of people, I think privacy is an issue. Like let's say you're a company or like an ML enthusiast and you want to train or just use a model that you just don't, you have data that's sensitive. Let's say you're I don't know, like let's say you're a health clinic and you want to ingest your patient records and be able to analyze it.
That's a
and
really
spit out
good
and give you,
example.
like a summary of it. You like, there's no way people are just sending that out to the cloud. So you would anonymize it. You would.
I
Build,
mean,
or
you
at least
can. I think there are like specific contracts you can have sometimes with those companies to be extra data sensitive, but like maybe you can trust like ChatGPT in that regard, but like definitely not like DeepSeek or something like that.
fine tune a model so that you could use it for your particular purposes. And the ability to do that on a device locally is an increasingly desirable technology. Now, there's a lot of models you can use to do this, but there's one in particular that's extra interesting. It's DeepSeek R1. Now, that model, the 671 billion...
By the way, a small criticism here towards DeepSeek, which I mean, first of all, respect to even have the 671 billion parameter model out there at all. But really, could we not fit like, I don't know, like a 200 billion parameter model somewhere in between like 70 billion? You have all these gradual steps from 1.5 to 7 billion, right? To 8 billion, which these are roughly the kinds of models you would make run on a smartphone. Then you have like models that are more for like a desktop computer. And then you are moving out completely out of consumer hardware, unless you want to count the 512 gigabyte M3 Ultra Max Studio as consumer hardware, right? Like, could we really not have something that was roughly 90 gigabytes, right? You can already see the scaling here.
parameter model.
Yeah, sure, like 32 to 70 billion, right? Roughly double, more than doubles a little bit. Okay. So let's say at 140 billion parameters, it would have been 80 gigabytes. That would have fit nicely into a lot of the new Ryzen AI Max chips that max out at 128 gigabytes and give you up to 96 gigabytes of usable GPU memory. And then you would still have 32 gigabytes for the rest of your system, so your system actually stays stable.
Is 404 gigs, and it has to all fit into VRAM. And I say VRAM because it has to be very high bandwidth for that memory. So GPUs, the memory.
Apple's memory modules by themselves are not very fast. They're LPDDR5, but they're on a super huge bus. So that's how it can still be fast enough.
GPUs is called VRAM, video memory, and GPUs, because they process a lot of data in parallel, like all at once, a lot of pixels pumping through, being processed, they have access to extremely fast memory. And this system, because it uses Apple's unified memory architecture, has a lot of super fast memory. So I tested this device and compared its performance over several AI models and several hardware.
Okay, so 7 billion parameters, 14 billion parameters. By the way, guys, we've been streaming for a little over an hour. Shout out for the YouTube Jazz again. Subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting. Liking really is basic, really helps us out a lot. It attracts new people almost immediately to the stream. So that would be very, very appreciated. And if you have any questions, suggestions, big agreements or disagreements, let me know in the chat. So DeepSeek R1, that's the 7 billion parameter. M3 Ultra, I don't think this one is benefiting at all from the memory here. And I don't think the M3 is being bottlenecked here by the 24 gigabytes either. I honestly think this is just scaling, where M4 Max has it has only one Apple Neural Engine, right? M2 Ultra has 2, but those are just older, so you roughly end up with the same amount of performance, while M3 Ultras neural engine. It's slightly slower than the one on the M4 Max, but it is basically like double charged, right? So this scaling to me makes a lot of sense. Plus, if it actually, like, we do not just see scaling, of course, based on the neural engine, but also the raw GPU as well. So here we are probably not seeing any significant memory limitations. Maybe some could come up here. Definitely some could come up here. But like 128 gigabytes should still be plenty here. And you can even see how the M4 Max with the same amount of memory for the 32 billion parameter model overtakes the M2 Ultra. So its newer graphics architecture, its newer neural engine helps it compete with a chip that has more GPU cores, more neural engines even. So some interesting results.
Hardware configurations, and smaller models run quite well on the system.
It should be noted, though, that running AI performance is notoriously up and down a little bit. It's not the most stable. Those are not the most stable kinds of benchmarks. And part of that actually has to do with like the quantization level, like the level of imprecision they're targeting. That's part of what makes them fast. So this data could probably only be evaluated if you have like at least like 5 to 10 results for each chip.
Need all 512 gigs for any of the distilled smaller models, but the big one, that 671 billion parameter model, needs the highest configuration. Now, at first, it wouldn't even run. I was trying to load it into memory and it was crashing and just wasn't working the way that it should. And it turns out macOS locks how much VRAM it's willing to allocate out of the box. I had to go into terminal and open it up and give myself...
Yeah, so macOS, and it's fine, I only found it out while doing a little bit of research for the Ryzen AI Max chip. macOS by default gives you a similar hard limit with roughly 75% of your memory being allocatable, I guess, to VRAM. But it's not a hard limit as it is on the Ryzen AI Max chips. You can manually override it, which does lead me, of course, to question if you could also manually override it for something like the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395, could you potentially give it like a little bit over 110 gigabytes maybe, rather than maxing it out at 96 out of your 128? But yeah, we do know it's possible on the Mac.
448 gigs of VRAM, and it works. Now keep in mind, this is not the full version of DeepSeek R1. It is a 4-bit quantization of R1. It's close, but it's just not as accurate. Like, it's still got all the parameters, all 671 billion of them, but they're just not as detailed. It is a reduction in accuracy, but it is a big aspect.
You're probably looking at like a 2 terabyte model at that point, once we are not looking at the simplification level. He is definitely a little bit more negative here on the imprecision level here, because yeah, that's how you do local LLMs, but that's probably because he's considering that, oh, with Apple's like high RAM pricing and stuff like that, might it make sense to also like rent some server space, for example, where you actually do have access to something like 1 or 2 terabytes of memory.
Model, and it performs very well, all things considered. Now, the thing that I thought
MKBHD has become a mainstream tech icon, cited by major media like The Verge and CNBC. His endorsement often drives... Okay, you ask a fine question, apparently.
It was actually a better performing model at that 671 billion parameter size.
Mr. Who's the Boss, Aaron Maney, excels in smartphone comparisons and digestible tech explainers. Okay. Dave 2D offers concise, visually sleek laptop reviews, ideal for quick insights. Okay, that's not bad. I mean, it doesn't mention too much criticism. Why MKBHD stands out. While others excel in specific niches for formats, Marquez strikes a rare balance between quality, trustworthiness, and broad appeal. His ability to evolve with tech trends while maintaining high standards cements his position, blah, blah,
compared
blah.
to the 70 billion parameter. I think it's because of the architecture. That was the only thing that I could kind of figure out in my brain. But the fact is, it runs. The other thing is power consumption. So the power draw at wall when it was running that big model was well under 200 watts.
Yeah, like, and by the way, like, I listened to his video when I was like, well under 200, 170 watts, bro, is 15% lower than 200 watts. You might as well say it's under 180 or something like that.
And on a system, they say you built that with like PC hardware and you got a bunch of GPUs running, you would need, I don't know, 10, 12 GPUs to get that kind of RAM. Like,
yeah, I mean, if you would be like trying to combine like specifically like RTX 5090s, at that point you're also facing scaling issues. I mean, you can, by the way, combine these kinds of Macs via Thunderbolt 5 these days, and you can do a lot of performance sharing because these tasks are not very latency sensitive, so you can get really nice scaling. And I'm saying that based on Thunderbolt 4 results on previous generations. So I highly doubt that Thunderbolt 5 will become anytime soon a bottleneck for like the performance levels we're seeing here. But yeah, if you did want any kind of similar RAM amount, you would be working with like Quadro GPUs, and those are actually slower than the 5090, and the RAM prices are actually more egregious than Apple's prices, and you don't even get the benefits of like the super fast memory of GDDR7, of the full GDDR7 that we get on like the RTX 5080 and 5090. So it's a little bit, plus of course the power consumption penalty. The entire RTX 50 family is still on 4 nanometer. So yeah, it's a very interesting conundrum in that way, where you're definitely left with some hard choices. If this was an M4 Ultra and it had like a perfect Ultra Fusion interconnect and stuff like that, then I would say this would be the definitive device. But because it might be a little bit faster and stuff like that still, this might be a little slower than some would have hoped, though granted, as we had seen from the benchmark here, right? Doesn't matter how fast or slow you are, if you simply don't have the memory, you're just not running these tests, right? And actually getting to that amount of memory is basically impossible on anything but this before you hit like server level hardware. So yeah, it's interesting. Plus he also like pointed out that like the large model was actually faster than the 70 billion parameter model, which again, this could be fluctuation just between maybe he didn't run enough tests to average them. It could also be the difference that, as he said, he just wanted to say the architecture. Maybe Apple just gets better at utilizing all like 32 neural engine cores, all 80 GPU cores and stuff like that with the larger model.
the fact is, it runs. The other thing is power consumption. So the power draw at wall, when it was hardware RAM, like the amount of power draw, the difference in power is massive. It's probably like 10 times more electricity to run well, if you did it with that kind of PC hardware. There's obviously different ways to do it. But one thing to keep in mind, this system with the M3 Ultra chips does run at a higher wattage than both the M1 and M2 Ultra devices. Those used to be 370 watts, like for a peak consumption. This is now 480, and it's just like the chip is just...
Yeah, but you can also see that, by the way, from the test he was just running, you won't necessarily be hitting those. So Apple is very careful for their stationary devices to advertise peak power consumption numbers, and that is, and by peak, I really mean like temporary spikes. And the reason why they do that is probably because if you want to, like some people who have like mission critical workflows, right? Their power supplies, especially in the US where you have like lower voltage, might legit be strained. So knowing in which outlet to put which device, or whether or not to use like separators or not, really could come down to, does your device spike up to 300 watts or does it spike up to 400 watts? Even if the actual difference in like average peaks is more like 20, 30 watts, right? And it might be a difference between like 220 watts to 250 watts. But because the spikes are 50% higher roughly, the Apple advertises them. But don't ever think that this is like a almost 500 watt machine. It's simply not.
Powerful, draws more juice to be able to do it. Now, in terms of performance on that 4-bit quantized big-ass DeepSeek model, I think the speed is fine. Like once you hit 17, 18 tokens per second, I think the speed is good enough for most applications. Even for developers, you want like quick code and copy and paste it. I think that's usable. I don't love the quality of output. I feel like because
Well, to be honest, AI quality is not that great in general.
the 4-bit quantization is quite a big shrink in accuracy, it's not perfect. I think it just depends on what it is you're trying to get out of it, but it's the fact that it runs is like the most impressive thing to me. The other thing, pricing. I think when this product first launched, I saw a lot of conversation of like, oh, this is a really well-priced like local LLM. It technically is because we just don't have a lot of options to choose from. Building something like this with like, consumer-grade PC hardware would be quite expensive. But keep in mind that at the very minimum to get this kind of RAM, it's like $10K, right? And $10,000 buys you
Is it? So Mac Studio. So for the 256 or 512 gigabyte versions, we'll need the unbinned M3 Ultra. That's $1,500 more. So that's 9,500 with 500 with 1 terabyte of storage. So you only have double the storage as you have memory. But let's say you would just use external storage for everything on a product like this. I would also argue most people, unless you specifically want to run this DeepSeek model, you're probably fine with 256, which, yes, it's not cheap at that point. It's $7,000, but it does still stay in the like prosumer market rather than moving all the way up to like the pro market. And when it comes to this configuration, I actually wanted to cover this a little bit. I don't recommend this one because you're getting so many better things if you're going with the Mac Studio with the M4 chip at that point, right? So you can pick the M4 Max here fully enabled, give it 128 gigabytes, give it 1 terabyte of storage, and you end up with like a little bit less in terms of price. Yes, you get actually more memory. Like 128 versus 96, and yes, you might not get the advantages of like the M3 being like having even more cores, but don't forget these P cores are roughly 20% faster. These GPU cores are roughly 20% faster. And you probably won't face any scaling issues and stuff like that. You will consume even less power. Plus, again, you actually end up with more memory. So while, yes, you do sacrifice stuff like Thunderbolt 5 on the front ports, but I doubt that this is like a significant hindrance to the vast majority of people considering this. So yeah, that would be roughly my recommendation, where again, almost $4,000 isn't cheap. I definitely would wish it was like 2 terabytes at this point. And probably at 3,500 with 2 terabytes, right? So I'm arguing for what, a 15% price reduction. So once again, my usual like wisdom that Apple's pricing is 10 to 15% higher than it needs to be, because down the road there will be discounts. It will also open up the used or refurbished market. It's very like valuable if those are actually like 30% cheaper. So yeah, this wouldn't be a bad configuration for most people, in my assumption. Plus, I mean, if you are getting 2 terabytes, you probably are almost independent at that point from like external storage. Which, like, what bothers me here though is like, you're paying $400 for 1 terabyte more, right? But now you're paying $600 for 2 terabytes more. So your price per gigabyte is actually significantly lower here. So if that was actually $300 here, that would bring us to a nice 4,000 and probably be a package I actually recommend to more people. Yeah, I know some will say, oh, it's a 10% of the price. The people buying this don't care. Believe me, I did care. Like, even by the time I was speccing up my MacBook and I was reaching almost like 30, like basically around 3,500 with 1 terabyte, I was really asking myself, again, not because I'm severely financially limited, but I was like, do I want to give Apple money for the 2 terabytes here? Because it does send kind of the wrong message. So maybe consider sending them the better message here too. We definitely need this to start, by the way, with 1 terabyte. And then the upgrade to 2 terabyte to be way cheaper, and then the upgrade to 4 terabyte actually could stay roughly the same, because at that point it's only for the pros who could actually afford those higher prices. But yeah, Apple's logic in that regard is not quite sound. It's basically geared towards like extracting money also from the cheaper customers, because there's a lot more of them. Even if only a fraction of them make that choice to get more storage and RAM, it's probably still a higher amount of people than if a vast percentage of the pro customers get an upgrade. Yeah, but that's about it from Dave 2D.
Ton of server time, or just like, if you want to get a subscription to something, it's a lot of money that this will get you far in terms of a subscription. But for people that need that private localized version,
also that's of course assuming you are literally not doing anything else, right? Because if you're you cannot compare the $10,000. Oh, by the way, I was comparing USD prices, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, but yeah, maybe with taxes we are actually looking at 10,000 then for the 512 gigabytes M3 Ultra. But one thing I was going to say is, and I kind of forgot it, but you cannot just say, oh, it's $10,000. How much money do I get for what do I get for 10K in terms of like cloud subscriptions, access to server infrastructure? Because you still need a decent machine, right? So at that point, you're looking more of a difference of like, again, if we are actually looking at this M4 Max, for example, that I just spec'd out, because you probably do still want like decent on-device capabilities. Now you're looking at more of like a difference of $6,000, which at that point in terms of server infrastructure doesn't actually get you too far. So just trying to explain it, like if you still want to stay firmly in the Mac ecosystem and you want a machine at home that still runs pretty well and does give you some offline capabilities for AI, you're not looking at saving $10,000 or $9,000 or $8,000 or even $7,000 versus the M3 Ultra. You're more looking at saving like $6,000. And again, if we're looking at a lot of storage, more like $5,000. Yeah, but that's about it for the videos that I have prepared for today to react to. That does not actually mean we are quite finished. Obviously, other websites are posting reviews. By the way, I mentioned in the past that I would create like a spreadsheet of like benchmarks. To be quite honest, now that we are several months removed from the A18 launch and the M4 launch, I don't think it's really necessary. I apologize for having been more busy in January when I actually planned on doing it. And now, of course, I'm leading into a very busy March. So I hope you have some understanding for that. I also think that a lot of testing has gotten okay, at least roughly, and all the standard tests you can still find on basically every website, right? So here, for example, M4 Max versus M3 Ultra, we see a reduction in single core performance. Funny enough, that still would leave you with roughly the fastest single core CPU performance versus any x86 device. We get roughly 50% more multi-core results, and we get, like in terms of GPU, actually not that great of scaling, but granted, that's also why I'm saying like Cinebench it's not great for everything. And ironically, even though, of course, the actual apps are mostly used with GPU acceleration, their GPU benchmarking is actually worse than their CPU benchmarking. Then Geekbench, we see, of course, the similar problems. We see like lower single core performance. We actually don't see too much of an uplift in multi-core performance, and that primarily has to do with Geekbench 6 being much more real-world app optimized. It just doesn't scale with too many extra cores that well, and it really likes the single core performance that M4 generation chips are offering it. You still get roughly like what, a 25% improvement here, or now actually more like 30% improvement over the M2 Ultra. So you see, we are not actually being bottlenecked in some way. It's just that M4 Max is that good, at least by Geekbench standards. Geekbench, just ignore OpenCL. In terms of metal, the scaling actually is not terrible. Versus M2 Ultra, it depends on your actual GPU task, right? This is more like raw compute. Of course, in stuff like 3D rendering, you would see uplifts from other parts, like the hardware accelerated ray tracing. But versus the M4 Max, it's not terrible. But again, consider the value. This is a machine roughly double the price. Puget Bench for Premiere Pro and for Photoshop, these tasks really like single core performance. So that's where we see the increase over the M2 Ultra, but a decrease over the M4 Max. And in rendering, we see the advantage of newer encode engines versus the M2 Ultra, and of course of more encode engines versus the M4 Max. So this scaling to me makes a lot of sense, and I'm actually very happy that I can reference The Verge in like a somewhat positive manner. And then when we are looking at something like the M4 Max and M3 Ultra review by Ars Technica, you'll actually find a lot of benchmarks, and I don't want to go through all of them today. We'll probably look into like M3 Ultra performance down the line. Actually, let me see if Geekervan has something maybe already. No, so they just posted their 9070 XT review, which is a pretty good value GPU in comparison to the RTX 5000 family, but maybe if they down the road have like a deep M3 Ultra analysis, I will consider watching that. But we see Cinebench results. Also, people love still bringing up Cinebench R23. It's completely worthless, but you can actually see it does give you some pretty good results for the M3 Ultra, because it's just not very well optimized in general for ARM chips. So yeah, R23 pretty worthless in that regard. Blender benchmark, this is CPU Blender, which you probably will never use a CPU Blender. You probably want to use it with GPU acceleration. We actually see not too bad scaling versus the M4 Max. But yeah, like this is where we see just that some tasks are actually pretty good at spreading themselves out over a lot of CPU cores, and some tasks are not. And Blender definitely can leverage your CPU cores. Geekbench single core, we've already covered that here. A Geekbench multi-core also makes sense. Definitely here, the M3 Ultra being actually very close to the M4 Max. So again, once you consider value, it's probably not the best proposition. Geekbench 6 Compute Metal, yeah, we see all those results that we have kind of known for. Of course, you also see some of the scaling issues, as not only do we go from like a larger to a larger die from like M4 Pro to M4 Max, so we don't get already perfect scaling here. Like roughly 10% of the performance gets lost. Granted, that could also be a Geekbench issue. Some games actually do scale pretty perfectly, but then also older architecture now more scaling issues because of Ultra Fusion. Doesn't actually have as significant of a memory uplift because, again, this might be a smaller bus, but faster memory modules. So nothing crazy. And versus M2 Ultra, a noticeable improvement, but not one that would necessarily make you spend thousands of dollars for an upgrade. GFX Bench old test doesn't really matter to me. So you see some really weird results at that point. It might just have refused, honestly, to utilize the second GPU die. And yeah, so GFX Bench is a completely worthless benchmark in that regard. This is Blender Benchmark 4.2 now with GPU acceleration. I don't know the differences between like just how much has changed between Blender 4.2 and 4.3. Most of the tests I am seeing now with 4.3, of course, we have seen stuff like the RTX 5090 being roughly 2 times faster than the M3 Ultra. That would still be true if you like just use like different results here. Actually a lot of results. Also, we have some energy usage. No idea what happened here with the untitled stuff. Wait, is untitled all the... As for their upsides and downsides, the biggest downside is obviously that the M3 Ultra comes with 3 M3 class single-core performance. Single-core performance, the M3 Ultra does eventually start to run the expected circles around the M4 Max when it comes to multi-threaded CPU work and GPU benchmarks that are actually bottlenecked by the GPU. The M3 Ultra does use more power on the load than M2 Ultra and M1 Ultra. Okay, 77 watts in our handbrake video encoding test. Should be noted, I have never met a Mac person who actually uses Handbrake. I always see Handbrake being brought up by people who want a cross-platform test. And of course, Handbrake exists on both Windows and Mac OS. But I just find it funny whenever you have like Handbrake and it's just Macs. And I'm like, oh, now that test is pretty worthless. So MP4 encode, lower is better. M3 Ultra is the fastest here, but you're not gaining that much. Just for your consideration. Do they have an M3 Max here? Would love to see the scaling, but they don't. But I just assume that M3 Max is always like 15-20% slower than M4 Max. So power consumption here in M3 Ultra definitely being higher. However, also consider, of course, it's higher here versus M2 Ultra. Don't compare it versus M4 Max. And you can see, by the way, like, yeah, Handbrake definitely does tax the chip, but a chip that can run at roughly 200 watts and peak at roughly 400 something watts, it's definitely not like... It's not seeing any crazy utilization here with 77 watt output. Handbrake average CPU power consumption. Watts is measured via hardware info. And yeah, it's like monumentally more efficient than still any like desktop hardware we have. Like this, by the way, this is a 3 nanometer chip from Intel, the 285K. So it's not just that Apple uses newer nodes to be more efficient. You would probably have better efficiency by using something like the 9800X3D. Just having that extra CPU chiplet, it definitely does impact power consumption often more than it actually impacts performance. So just keep that in mind. Handbrake, second slow is better. Okay, so nothing surprising here. Okay, so that, of course, all makes sense. The scaling is not bad, but of course, keep in mind that the M4 was actually a surprisingly big uplift over the M3 generation. So that leaves an M3 Ultra with certain downsides, even over an M4 Max, and certainly in terms of value, right? Well, previously, we got like an M2 Max Studio starting at $2,000, and an M2 Ultra at $4,000. So same generation chips, but now we have an M4 Mac Studio starting at $2,000 and an M3 Ultra starting at $4,000. Now, granted, you do get disproportionately more memory this time around with the M3 Ultra, but whether or not you actually benefit from 96 versus 64 gigs of memory, that's for you to decide. Tom's Hardware, not too many details. I think they have like one gaming benchmark, which I always find funny here. Gaming performance in frames per second. So this is, by the way, they're only testing here the M4 Mac Studio, and we're actually getting some decent scaling. But I'm just trying to tell you, scaling is never 100% perfect. Once you add more compute units and stuff like that, especially if you are using low resolution. So I have no idea why they weren't testing this at like 1440p medium settings or even high, but tested it at 1080p ultra. That's just not going to give you the best scaling results. The Mac actually was forced to run at a higher resolution, which is funny. But that's about it for what we can get out of the out of today's reviews for the MacBook Air and the Mac Studio. I think especially with the MacBook Air, we don't ever really have to go back to it because I don't think that anything will change unless we find out something like silly, like Apple once again downgraded storage speeds. But even here, you see that the summaries for the MacBook Air reviews are way more simple than they are for the Mac Studio. Now, there is one big rumor that I do want to cover before we finish up. And that is actually one that does go back to our favorite Apple leaker, Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. I will not spend too much time on it because I do think that there is... like, how do I say it nicely? I don't think it's a transformative rumor in any way, shape, or form because there's just not enough details in it. And it is a little bit the kind of rumor that I feel like Mark Gurman can easily go back on and say, oh, it was internally delayed at Apple for 2020. Now, iOS 18, if you remember the rumors, there are two pieces of rumors. One was that iOS 18 would be the largest change in iOS history or the biggest upgrade ever. But that was not a rumor about its design. It was about features like Apple Intelligence. It was about stuff like a redesigned, improved control center, right? That was part of iOS 18. More customization for the home screen. It was not about the redesign. There was a rumor that iOS 18 would be redesigned, but it wasn't actually something that most credible leakers stood by. Now, if Mark Gurman had predicted with every last generation of iOS, oh, we are getting a redesign this year, or we are getting a redesign this year, it would be a little bit like the boy who cried wolf situation, where at some point I just stopped listening. But because he didn't, and he focused primarily with iOS 18 on actual features, which is what ended up happening, I do believe that he is worth listening to at least a little bit with iOS 19, and supposedly being one of the most dramatic software overhauls in Apple's history. With some of the biggest design changes we've seen in over a decade, and that it would actually bring Mac and iOS/iPadOS designs closer together, making them more consistent. So it's very important, though, that a few tidbits that are being left here and there in this report, which thank you to 9to5Mac for summarizing it, because once again, I'm not paying for the Power On newsletter. Those tidbits are speculative, so they are not actually based 100% on like internal leaks that Mark Gurman has access to. Partially they are, and we've had some rumors from leakers like John Prosser from Front Page Tech. So you should kind of, if you want to believe that iOS 19 brings a redesign, you probably are not basing it just on this rumor, but like combining a lot of tidbits that we've been getting over the last few months. So he outlines this as following. It goes well beyond the new design language and aesthetic tweaks. For the iPhone, it will allegedly be the biggest revamp since iOS 7. As a refresher, of course, iOS 7 was a huge redesign. It went away from Apple's skeuomorphic design language to a more simplified and flat design. A lot of people complain about this change until this very day. But he does not necessarily say that it's going to be as big as iOS 7, right? We are not moving back to skeuomorphism, most likely here. He also says that macOS 16, because yes, we are getting iOS 19 and macOS 16, of course, would be the most significant upgrade to the Mac since macOS Big Sur, which of course macOS Big Sur introduced a lot of the flatter design language and stuff like squircles? No, no squares. No, it's not square circle. What are like rounded rectangles? What is the abbreviation for that Steve liked to do? Maybe it is squircles. But will squircles be like circled squares, which it's basically like these shape of icons. So previously we had much more open icon designs that could be basically any shape you want. Obviously on something like watchOS and visionOS we have circles. On Apple TV we have like very rectangular elongated icons, but then on iPhone, iPad and Mac we now have a very consistent icon shape, not necessarily the design itself. You see, for example, here on like the automator icon, it doesn't actually fit perfectly into the squircle or the rounded rectangle, the rounded circle. There are some parts that like stand out a little bit, and that is not something that is allowed on iOS. So either macOS gets even more changes that simplify it down to the level of iOS and iPadOS, or potentially iOS gets some of the higher freedoms of macOS icons. Of course, there's also another point, and that is the design is loosely based on visionOS, which of course visionOS, the biggest thing I see people say, oh, it has circular icons, right? But to me, the main design aspect of visionOS, for one, is its transparency and translucency. I don't think that makes sense to be ported to iOS, iPadOS, or macOS, because the translucency is served by the pass-through visual interface, right? You're not looking at just a regular background most of the time. You're looking at your regular environment. So your icons, your actual like window menus and stuff like that being transparent actually serves a purpose that it wouldn't serve on iOS and iPadOS. So in my understanding, that loosely based would basically be from visionOS, it might be that it's a little bit more three-dimensional, which macOS actually is a little bit three-dimensional. Like some of the icons feature more shadows and stuff like that versus iOS. But in my humble opinion, loosely based on visionOS would basically suggest it's a little bit shinier, right? Which if you've interacted with visionOS, it's a little bit more vibrant in areas. But otherwise, I just cannot find the logic to just port the aesthetics of visionOS, which is focused on this pass-through based UI, like to iOS and iPads and Macs, which are like these flat screen devices you either touch or interact with a mouse. So yeah, I'm not sure. So Apple will revamp the style of icons. So again, the style of icons could mean the shape, could of course mean what's actually in the icon. He does not specify in which direction it would go. Menus, apps, windows. With Windows, we're primarily looking at stuff like higher transparency with Windows and menus. And system buttons. System buttons are like system button visionOS. like those toggles in the settings app, right? This is actually like a good overview, right? It's just a little bit more, like, I wouldn't even say that much more vibrant at this point. Some of the vibrancy has come to the OS, but like maybe that these icons, that like the buttons are a little bit more pronounced. But honestly, I don't even think that visionOS is that different from iOS these days. I just think it's specifically optimized for the user environment that you're in, which is different from iOS. I'm not asking for a huge redesign. I would prefer features like volume mixer to be in here. But I know that, of course, this will get a lot more clicks, a lot more excitement. And if down the road Apple keeps excluding devices like the iPhone XS, iPhone 11, iPhone 12 down the road from these kinds of newer looking, newer feeling operating systems, that of course will also incentivize upgrades from those users. So I fully understand why they kind of feel a little bit forced into making a redesigned OS. But let's continue with what exactly is being said here. So the design goal here is to make the software platforms more visually consistent. Apple also plans to simplify the way users navigate and control their devices. I have, of course, this is said without any extra details. This could be something that is entirely unrelated to design, and it could be something like, Apple Intelligence, deep system control, and in-app integration. Could also be like just like a redesigned settings app or something like that. I mean, we just got a control center redesign, but at that point, though, we do not have the new control center on the Mac, for example. So we might have a more consistent design and now a new control center on the Mac, but it's technically the same control center as it is on iOS. But maybe with some visual tweaks to make it all look a little bit more like visionOS. But because of how vague Mark is here, I have to make all that guesswork, which I hate. Yeah, but obviously this does go back to like that front page tag video with the camera app. Here's your first look at iOS 19.
I have seen some things ever making use of their. This could mean that when you swipe the camera app away, your immediate that is down in the description. iOS and that designs to just perfect, right? The toggle.
Okay, yeah. So this is basically what we got thus far. According to him, it's adjacent to visionOS, but it's shinier. I mean, like the outline of the control elements, they are shinier. Again, you can argue whether or not that makes sense for iOS. I don't think it looks bad at the very least, right? So I won't be angry if that change happens, but I also don't think it's the most necessary change ever. Yeah, but that's about it, because I will not indulge Mark Gurman here with too much of my time with this specific rumor, because I don't think it's a transformative rumor in any way. If it turns out to be actually as big, I do hope that before WWDC, he actually commits to what changes we should expect to see. Because one thing that I would hate to get is like him being once again like a week or a few days before DubDub, he comes along and tells us everything we should expect at DubDub, rather than actually being like a significant leaker and leaking it like months in advance, right? That's something we used to get from John Prosser, for example, which granted he got his sources burned or he got burned by a source. So I'm not saying it's easy to replicate that, especially on a consistent level and especially as part of a more reputable outlet like Bloomberg. Just trying to point out where the leaker landscape has definitely changed, and it's not all to the best, at least in my opinion. Yeah, guys, that's about it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. So there are no other things being Apple Vice reported here. Some people say we might get new iPhone 16 colors. Personally, I don't care too much about that. But who knows? Maybe maybe by the middle of this week we'll get like a surprise iPhone color announcement. Maybe we would get like an actually colorful iPhone SE. But I'll react to that if we actually get like reputable sources, or if it actually like just drops on us one day. Thank you so much for tuning in. I won't be able to stream as much going forward in March and early April. Probably might be back at the end of April. So it was very fun. I'm not ending this channel or anything like that, but I'm just trying to point out some changes in the regularity of my schedule. Even if I manage to stream, those streams will be relatively short. So keep that in mind. And beyond all that, I'm just so immensely grateful for all your support. Last shout out, now that we're close to the 2-hour mark, to do the YouTube jazz. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it, and comment. Don't just comment in the live stream, also comment afterwards. That helps with the algorithm. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter or in Blue Sky to connect with me. And as always, let me know what you would like to see me cover next. Thank you so much for everything. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.